we've kind of covered, what makes the computational calculus. We've covered a little bit about sort of the basic tools, and then how those tools relate to other tools in the uh, both in programming and in computer science. So in particular, we've looked at computational calculi and operational semantics. So the basic use of grammar and SOS style rewrite rules, and how that relates to theories like Levier theories and graph-enriched Levier theories. We've also, or looked at it from the point of view of how the grammars of computational calculus look like class specifications or programming language specifications, and data structure specifications in a programming language, and the operational semantics can look like functional specifications. So that's how to relate it on the both on the mathematical side and on the programming side. So we've looked at that. We've looked at some enrichments of various calculi. So from pi calculus to row calculus, from row calculus to the row calculus in space. And then we've also looked at the logic, right? So we've looked at the why of computational calculi, in the sense that we use these because they come with the theory of equivalence that allows for equational reasoning, and then that correlates to being able to use a logical means to describe types or constraints on a variety of terms within the calculus. So we've looked at all of these things, but I wanted to go back to sort of the beginning, and say, the reason I became so interested in this methodology and this approach is because it seemed like the easiest way to go about correct by construction. And correct by construction seemed to me to be the best way to achieve some of my aims with respect to quality. That seemed like a methodology that provided the highest quality bar, and that was sort of my motivations for looking at this kind of methodology. And so I wanted to go around the room here and see what people have gotten out of this, and what they what they might use the methodology for now. What they might, what they're going to take away, and what they might go forward with. I think it's really always important to reconnect this back to our aims. So at the very beginning of this series, I asked everyone to state their aims with respect to this class. And so now I want to reconnect back to that statement of aim, and see how we've done. Did we achieve our aims? and what is that, and whether we did or we didn't, how does that relate to what we might do with what we've discussed, and hopefully things that we've learned in terms of going forward. So hopefully that all makes sense, in terms of my question. But if people wanted to go around the room, and sort of recapitulate your aims, and see, how do we do? Do we get there? Do we not get there? Um, what's uh, the measure of success here? So who wants to begin?
Well, I can I can start maybe. I don't have like something very specific. My aim was like from very beginning that I first listened to you, and I wanted to build a more like a different database, which will be uh, so that data and the program can be one thing. Because now is in the database, the data and the query is a totally different thing. So I think now I'm much closer, but
Cool, cool. Can you say a little bit more as to why you think you're closer? What, like,
uh,
in this database, what would be the query language?
so the query language and the data should be. I'm thinking in terms of raw calculus when the names are just quoted terms. So in that sense, I'm trying to. I'm thinking that now that I'm learning about the context, and I always have a difficulty to traverse to the graph of the data of the schema of the database, and so now I think that I'm closer because uh, I'm thinking about schema as a context for my query language, because the context changes. What can you write with your query?
Hmm. So that's an interesting approach. Let me make a suggestion. I would suggest that the formula from Ladle are your query language. Um, so so the types that are generated in the way that we've talked about are your query language. So the schema for the database is generated by the spec, by the computational calculus itself. So that's really just the grammar, and then your query language, it can be the formula. And so again, what we're storing is terms that are um, legal according to the grammar. And then we can query both on the basis of structure, so that would be the spatial formulae, and on the basis of behavior, that would be the modal formulae. And that would give us a much better GitHub, right? Because we'd be able to query on those bases. And if you think about it, what's going on with the blockchain, we automatically get a GitHub, right? Because all of the contracts are stored up on the blockchain. And Ladle, so they're already, the terms are already being stored. The question is, how would we go and search for them? And the formulae that we're generating from Ladle um, provide a very natural query language, right? And then how that relates to the context is, the context gives you the modal formula. So the context gives you can you reach this next state from where we are, where state is represented by terms. So that would be a sort of natural application of the things that we've talked about that lines up with the way SQL works today, but it significantly extends the power of SQL or other relational languages. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, thanks. Maybe not all right now, but and I can extend my term language. I can store my terms in the database, and they can change. So the schema can change, right?
If you so if by the schema can change, let's think about that. If you're talking about the schema changing, like the term started off as a term in the pi calculus, and then you decided to change the schema so that it becomes a term in the ambient calculus. Well, that's a pretty wild system, right? That's a very wiggly system. But if you're just talking about a term that starts off, say, in the pi calculus, and then evolves under the reduction rules and becomes a new term in the pi calculus, well, the schema hasn't changed, but the term has. Right? The schema is still derived from the pi calculus, right?
Yeah, and I'm thinking more like that. Yeah, like
Okay.
I added column on the renamed column, or
Yeah. So in that case, schema hasn't changed, right? It's just that the term has evolved. But in the evolution of the term, it still matches the schema because it's recognized by the grammar. Cool. Awesome. No, thank you. That's a wonderful, wonderful elucidation, and it fits perfectly with what we're talking about, because there you would get, if you follow that design pattern that we were just discussing, you would get a correct by construction query system, which would be lovely. I would love to see that. Yeah. Awesome. So anyone else?
Yeah, I can go.
Okay.
So quite a few years ago, I read this book by Jaron Lanier called "You Are Not a Gadget," and in there, he talks about a number of things, but he talked about a formal language for the law might be needed, and that got me really interested. So I just kept that in the back of my mind, and also got interested in the idea of a democratic workplace or a business process language. And so I wanted like kind of tiny law, meaning inside of a workplace, how people coordinate just to get day-to-day things done to create something of value. And so that got me into like workflow and business process languages. But then I found, of course, smart contracts in the blockchain space, but the languages were just like normal languages, and I didn't know how to map that. How would you map that to a contract? And so then I found our chain and the pi calculus, which has interaction between names, and I thought, well, boy, that seems a lot like just what we do if the names are names of people and their interactions. And then, of course, the row calculus, which adds process to that, kind of a unifying theory where you're not just sending data to each other, but you have you can send process and data are, there's not a distinction there. So that seemed like, wow, okay, this is great. Now, I don't know if from this class if the right way to, one thing I want is for these process languages, these human interaction process language, to be accessible to everyone, because everyone needs the capability to to participate in the definitions of the rules that affect them. So learning about languages, how to design languages, if that means building domain-specific languages to serve that need or something like that, that's where maybe this could go for me.
Well, that's a very interesting area. Let me respond to that, and then I want to ask a follow up question. Um, uh, so so part of what I've become very interested in expressing um, is the notion of agency, and I'm fascinated by how our notion of agency is related to our cultural circumstances. So if you think about logic, Aristotelian logic, um, the notion of agency that is embodied in Aristotelian logic is striking given the cultural context. Um, the cultural context was one in which they didn't have computers, right? They didn't have even calculators. They didn't have even a Babbage machine. The kind of machines that they had were like catapults, and very very practical machines, which clearly were bound up with a notion of resource. But the kind of computational engine that they were describing with Aristotelian logic is much, 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 much closer to the lambda calculus than it is to anything like linear logic. So linear logic would have corresponded to a resource-bounded machine, whereas lambda calculus correspond and intuitionistic logic correspond to um, a machine that takes information and produces decisions. Right. So and the reason is because lambda is completely insensitive to resource use. Right. It says resources are copyable anywhere and everywhere. Beta reduction does all kinds of copying everywhere. And so it has no sense of the cost of the interaction with or use of resources. Um, so so the notion of agency that they was developed in the time of Aristotelian logic in the time of Aristotle was surprisingly forward thinking, right? It was thousands of years anticipatory, right? Isn't that very strange?
You mean the simple logic of ands and ors and such?
Yeah, not just ands and ors, but also modus ponens, right? I have A implies B,
Mhm.
and I have A. And when I put them together, I get B,
Mm.
right? That simple deduction um, takes does not take into account how much it might have cost me to get either A and A implies B, which is effectively building a machine like a catapult, and how much it might have cost me to procure A. And as a result of this insensitivity to resources, their notion of logic is much more like a courtroom, right? It takes in information and produces decisions than it is like the kinds of machines that they saw around them.
Hmm.
And so now if you move forward and you say, well, what, at what point do they get a sense of agency? Well, that involves resource. At what point does that come into our conception of computation, and computational agency? It doesn't happen until 1987, really, um, uh, with a small caveat, that Turing, and his conception of computational agency clearly had a notion of resource, and that's why Turing machines were used so extensively in complexity theory. Um, so around the 1930s, we get a notion of computational agency that has a notion of resource, but it's not compositional. So Turing's conception is not compositional, um, and this is very important. This compositionality is very important, um, because the notion of computational agency, as conceived by Turing, is effectively not biological. The biological systems are necessarily compositional, right? Um, any reproductive system ends up being compositional. So the notion of agency, that that Turing has, computational agency that Turing comes up with, is not compositional, but it does finally account for resources. And it isn't until 1987, with Jean-Yves' linear logic, that you start to get a notion of computational agency, that both accounts for resources and is compositional. And but now, they're missing something else, which is the idea that you might have autonomous agents that interact with each other. Right? We see this every day, right? People are autonomous. They act autonomously with respect to each other. Trees act autonomously, right? With respect to with respect to each other, right? So the autonomy part is now missing from the notion of computational agency. Um, and with that, the first time that shows up is in the pi calculus. So that notion of so at that point we have a notion of computational agency that includes a resource sensitivity and autonomy. So that's the first time that we can actually describe, in a formal like language, where we can actually we can do calculation, and we can do simulation, and we can do the specification, um, that much notion of agency. And I'm focusing on a notion of agency to get at the heart of your interest here, right? The notion of agency is fundamental to the notion of contract, right? Contract is really about entities which have agency and how to constrain, or obligate them, or give them rights, and to ensure that those rights are somehow respected, right? So
It's so funny it's so funny you say that, because just over the last couple of days, as I've been thinking about this business model that I've been thinking about a lot, is a name for it is autonomous ownership, which I think is both autonomous plus agent, well, not agency, but resource.
that's right. Yes.
And because the model there is, if you have not been compensated for this combined effort you've put together in some project, then you would have agency because you have a stake, and that leads to this sort of autonomous ownership, that once you no longer have been uncompensated, so once you've been fully compensated, then you're gone from the from the system. So it's mobile, like our calculus in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, just funny how that those abstract things that you're mentioning here, I think draw to, or somehow have linked with what I've been thinking about. How to express that in a language for people to feel that this is something that they themselves can work with and change is a real challenge.
Yes, understood. And it has to, you have to work from both ends, right? You have to get it to the point where the notions that you're trying to describe are sufficiently captured, and so that's working from a certain conception of the requirements, just to being able to express them. And then, but you also have to work at it from, and now, who are the clients that are going to use this to actually express them, and is this couched in a setting that matches their needs and expectations, right? So when I was working with biologists, you know I was able to, quickly grasp that the computational calculi, in the form of the mobile process calculi, were sufficient to capture many of their desiderata. But was it in a format that they could understand, right? They had developed their own languages, their own ways of thinking about biological agency, and so the question was, could we connect their way of thinking about it to the formal means that had developed via the mobile process calculi, and that's still an ongoing dialogue, right? There's still a lot going on, but there's one piece of agency that we haven't talked about, and that is evolutionary agency. So agency that is adaptive, and is generationally adaptive, right? So it's one thing to be, and we have to think about this on different levels, right? So there's the notion of agency, um, in when we talk about biological adaptation, right? There's a mechanism that is built in terms of the genome and the phenome, right? So the the phenome, the individual agent, um, uh, may be intelligent and adaptive to a particular situation, but the species, um, um, of of that particular agent, can also evolve over time, right? So the generationally, their genome carries enough information to evolve them, across the species, and that's another kind of agency, and that also has lots of different, uh, uh, so in the 1980s, so late 70s, early 80s, John Holland proposes a kind of formal notion of evolution. So with his book Adaptation in Natural and Artificial Systems, he begins to get at uh, this kind of evolutionary agency, and I have argued, um, fairly extensively, that the clearest notion, of the, and that supports this kind of evolutionary agency is reflection. So if you think about it in the biological setting, the genome phenome link is exactly that. The genome sort of is the reification of the phenome, right? It turns information about the execution of the individual back into code, some kind of biological artifact that can then be tinkered with, back into data. So you take the running system of a particular individual and you turn it back into data, which is the genetic expression, then you can tinker on that data, and then you can re-express those genes as a new individual, right? So that's most when we think about computational mechanisms, the reflective mechanism is most like that kind of adaptive agency. So with the row calculus, as an example, you get um, you get all of the kinds of agency that we've talked about. So you get a notion, a resource sensitive agency that has a notion of autonomy and is able to express adaptation. So I believe that with the row calculus, you get sufficient notions of agency to be able to go after the kinds of contractual apparatus that you talked about, but over a broad scale of situations. So, as just one example, and then we'll move on to the next person, because I find this to be a very rich area, which is why it deserves a lot of attention. But what we're seeing now is a movement to extend our notion of law and rights out beyond human agency. All right, so there's a movement within those people who are concerned about the environment and climate to want to give rights to rivers and forests and species and the planet as a whole. And I think that this is actually quite practical and in many ways necessary. And that in order to do this, we're going to have all of these characteristics in our notion of agency that I've just mentioned. So I think that we're actually on track to be able to go after those kinds of contractual arrangements that might end up protecting our home. um, all right, thank you, Glenn. That was a really wonderful area of discussion. Sorry for rambling on about that. Um, anyone else? Who's next?
Sure, I can go. Yeah, thanks for this class. This has been really useful in, at least for myself, one of the objectives I had was having a deep understanding of ladle and knowing that there was, some of the theory that I didn't understand. I really didn't understand the outline of it outside of just like the general idea of type, and then didn't have the category theory understanding either. But I think I now have a pretty good understanding of the general outline that is going to motivate my study of category theory, to actually understand how you get there with the categorical representation. And I am just really interested in discovering deeper this tie between math and computational calculi that's sort of been uncovered with the row calculus and with the categorical representation of the calculi. And I think that there's we've only discovered few different types of computational calculi right now, and there's been a large explosion of them. And this class has also been awesome in introducing me to some of those, like the blue calculus and mobile process calculus and others, ambient process calculus and others. I'm just interested in sort of comparing these, understanding what types of physical systems they're able to model, what the limitations are, and what new calculi might be to uncover some of those gaps. And one of the things that I'm interested in understanding more is like how they apply to um, how they apply to modeling of physics, of mechanics, um, and you know it seems like what you said, or maybe what I heard of what you said is that um, we can potentially we have these programs that are used to solve equations, um, to solve these to figure out what an observation is of a thing moving through space. But it would be really interesting to be able to model those things moving through space as processes, and the measurements of them as some sort of observation, and then use the properties of biosimulation, and use the connections to categories to understand these further. But yeah, I feel like I'm just sort of at the beginning of my journey here for sure. Um, yeah.
No, that's awesome. I mean, you touched on a number of really important points. The one thing I would argue, and I feel like I argued it really, really um, explicitly in the paper that Mike Stay and I did for Hydra, which is the higher dimensional rewrite systems paper, where we laid out a categorical semantics for pi-like things, is that category theory is actually not well suited for a lot of phenomena, and in particular, the phenomena of the mobile process calculi are a really, really good example. And this is part of the reason I introduced this class in the way that I did. It's fairly easy to describe exceptionally powerful computational models using this methodology. And this methodology, has a native presentation that makes no reference to category theory. Um, the truth is that there are only a handful of people in the world who have any idea what we're saying when we say graph-enriched Levier theory, and there are even fewer number of them who know what we mean when we talk about a nominal graph-enriched Levier theories. Um, and the story gets even more complicated if we need to be able to restrict reduction to certain contexts. Like, so the COM rule in the row calculus, for example, doesn't allow reduction to happen underneath a 4 comprehension, right? It has to happen at the level of a 4 comprehension in par with some output. But what happens underneath the 4 is frozen. And in order to do that properly, the category theory is not sufficient. You have to do all kinds of tricks, like the tricks that we did in that paper. So, so my argument is that I can take people who have no background in category theory at all, and never mention category theory, and I can present the computational calculi to them, and they grok it almost immediately. So in the sense that, like, I can take 13 and 14-year-olds, and I can show them the methodology, the tools of the computational calculi, and they get it almost immediately, and they can be programming within a system designed in that way almost immediately. Whereas in order to absorb the kind of category theory necessary to describe what those computational calculi describe, requires years of training, literally years of training. And so I kind of I've tried to argue that category theory is powerful. There are a number of very, very interesting and important observations about the the composition of systems that category theory gets right and elucidates for us. In particular, the idea of naturality and the idea of coherence conditions are very, very important, and they're a way of kind of sanity checking our work that no other notions seem to have put forward yet. But the way it's organized is profoundly functional. It's a lot, so its notion of what computation looks like is very functional in the sense of, the lambda calculus kind of functional. And whereas so in particular, it makes a commitment to a notion of composition that has a very specific flavor, and it makes autonomy and mobility very, very difficult, um, to it's just very, very difficult to uh, express within the categorical framework. And so I believe it's really important to keep these different methodologies alive, and to continue to contrast and compare them. Their category theory made it possible to conceive of Ladle.
Right.
So it allows the right kinds of questions, but it would have made it damn near impossible. If I only had category theory, I don't think I would have found the row calculus.
Yeah.
Right.
That
Right.
It seems like, that there's been with both of them together, and with this like congruence that you have, even if it is in sort of like a weird corner of category theory, it seems that it's paid off, right, in the sense of Ladle. And from my understanding, it seems like it's uncertain, and we don't know what other types of payoff that there will be, because there's this correspondence. It seems like that there might be more to mine there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one place where I think this is going to be, there's going to be a significant payoff is in, category theory has already paid off in terms of reorganizing our notion of quantum mechanics. So just to give a brief taste of this, whether you look at the Feynman presentation of quantum mechanics, or the Heisenberg presentation of quantum mechanics, or the Schrodinger presentation of quantum mechanics, or the Dirac presentation of quantum mechanics, what's very difficult to grasp is what in those presentations is the actual quantum stuff, and what's an accident of the mathematical framework. It's very, very like if you look at the Heisenberg matrix mechanics, the question really is, which part of this is quantum, and which part of this is just the linear algebra, what the linear algebra brings into play by accident. And what Abramsky and Kuka were able to kind of get at was that if we re-express this in category theory, we can kind of get the axioms of quantum mechanics that are just quantum mechanics, and we can separate out all the rest. And the way in which category theory makes that separation clean is very useful, and it allows to see, like when you present it, the no cloning and quantum teleportation immediately fall out. Like Kuka rightly suggests that if you use one of these other presentations, it takes you some 60 years before you see quantum teleportation as a thing. But if you write it down in this axiomatic style, quantum teleportation is staring you in the face immediately. You can see its possibility in the same way that ladle was immediately conceivable because of the way category theory is organized. You're just led to ask those questions. The same thing is true here, where category theory leads you to quantum teleportation almost instantly. So in that sense, it's quite good. And going back to this topic of discussion of agency, for lack of a better word, quantum agency, I think, will be easier to express when we import the categorical techniques. And I think the place where this is most likely to be of enormous value is in the consensus arena. So if you think about quantum mechanics just for a minute, what's really going on is a measurement is a moment when all of the competing superpositions with respect to the distribution of resources amongst a bunch of agents, there's finally some consensus about it. So the measurement is the moment at which we achieve some consensus amongst the competing superpositions, right? And those competing superpositions can be thought of in terms of some autonomous agents, all of whom have a view with respect to those distributions. And at the moment of measurement, they all achieve consensus on that. So you can actually kind of look at the blockchain as a classical simulation of a quantum system. And so I fundamentally believe that the quantum mechanics is going to play a significant role in terms of consensus. And so being able to import quantum agency into our notion of agency will take us sort of to the next level of the kind of agency that we would like to have to describe the kinds of systems that we see in the natural world, which clearly include quantum agency. I mean, in point of fact, the last 10, 12 years has been this enormous growth of what's called the quantum biology, right? Starting from the fact that the gecko uses quantum effects to climb walls. There's been this enormous uptick in the biological exploitation of quantum effects, and I think if we're going to describe systems that are like what we see in the world, quantum agency is something that we're going to have to be able to articulate. So in terms of what your aims and goals, I'm delighted. It seems like we're on the right track there. Thank you very much, Jake. Let's see, what time is it now? All right. Who else? Anyone else?
So I think I'm the last one. Well, unless there's Colin, but I'll try to be brief. So I actually looked up what I had written for the sort of application for this, and I just said I wanted to attend this course in order to acquire a working understanding of what a computational calculus is and how it works and how to work with it. And that was my goal to learn the mathematical underpinnings of the systems that I'm working on, in this case, RChain, such that I could effectively understand and interact with the systems at the base level. And then my aim is that I intended to assimilate this information in a form in this course and combine it with the knowledge that I already have. And I plan to do this by collaborating with other like-minded individuals to try to discover sort of new knowledge. And as the course has progressed, I can think of at least 3 different kind of work study or kind of study group where I was able to interact with different individuals Jake and Glenn specifically, who are on this call now, to try to explore these ideas in more deep and richer fashions. And some of the things that Glenn talked about really strike me in the terms of how we interact with each other in community. And then when I was working with Jake to learn about the things at a very fundamental and kind of logical level. And Greg, in our conversations, we talk about things as, as diverse as physics and biology and all of these things that seem to be pervading the environment around us. And in my own work, I'm very interested in what is kind of cooperation and what is collaboration, and how we're all going to sort of make a shift that's required in our society to either bring us out of a position of existential crisis, which we are currently in, and into a new world that's, it's not a utopia. It's different, but it's also not in a place of crisis in an existential sense. So there's still conflict and potential. There's still things that aren't right, but we won't be in a position where we're threatening either all life on the planet or the planet itself. And I think those are all parts, what we're talking about here, that it all has a part to play. And I'm fascinated to see where this work goes, how it gets instantiated and implemented and communicated. And it's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Kenny. Yeah, no, I really, I've enjoyed engaging with you on these things, and I really feel like we've, you're bringing up this notion of cooperation. I think is essential, right? It's a part of. I really believe that it's hard for us to engage with things in a way that is quintessentially human if we don't have some way to know what it is we're doing. It doesn't necessarily have to be head brain knowledge. There are many people who are more heart centered, but they still have a kind of knowing that they're doing what they're doing. I think of the musician, right? The musician may not be able to tell you in a head brain centered way what it is they're doing when they're performing, but they certainly know what it is they're doing when they're performing, and it's not just playing notes. um, and so I feel like it's very difficult for us to be able to cooperate effectively without a framework for knowing what it is that we're doing. And I fundamentally believe that this sort of hill climbing towards a rich enough notion of agency is part of that picture. And I think that the computational calculi are essential tools in measuring what it is we know about our notion of agency. So yeah, I very much have a there's a simpatico with your way of going investigating this. So thank you very much for your engagement. I guess there's Colin is left, and we still have a few minutes.
Yes, hello, everybody. This is my first time talking with any of you people, as you probably have no idea who I am. But I take from the last 30 minutes I've caught that you guys are, some of the questions are pretty deep in this session, and you're having a bit of what it is that you've come for and what you've taken away, and sort of your travel so far. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, today's the last session, and so I always like to go back to the beginning and to see whether or not we achieved.
Excellent. Well, I guess I didn't miss out on everything. Well, I just wanted to say that I've been lurking, and halfway through I joined the co-op because I wanted to get a little deeper access to learn what technology is that's being offered. And honestly, I'm fascinated with and Lucas's meta stories that actually feel like there's a foundation behind them. You know, you hear all this pie in the sky talk about how to do, you know, this and that, and then he actually goes through and shows you some of this higher level mathematics, and it's very intriguing to somebody who has a curious mind like mine. So I fell right into category theory and all this stuff, and learned as much as I could as a hobby, but I knew I couldn't actually keep up and interact. I was too far behind. So anyway, I really like the way that you've done that, Lucas, and showed the gist of all of these mathematical things. And really, my goal was to compile the system, and I still plan on doing that.
Oh, sweet. That's great. Great. Well, glad to have brought you, enticed you that far in.
Oh, it's just amazing just to hear, you know, the history behind the math was just fascinating. Like some of the stories, I must not be the only one. You must have heard that from other people, that, you know, very, very intriguing. So thank you very much for that. And hopefully there's more to come. This is the last of the first class on the computational calculus. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, this is the 12th class. This is the last one in the series.
Okay.
Yeah, so we did 12 classes. We sort of covered the arc of the that, you know, we intended to, which was introducing the methodology, looking at some examples, looking at the why of the methodology, and then relating it to some new developments that have been exposed by the methodology.
Right. Well, I have been following along the YouTube series, like I say, and I do not have a really good view of all of the branches of what's going on with the project. Although I have seen various things, and it's very exciting, and so hopefully I will be able to catch up and take better part. But again, it's as a hobby, I'm not even sure what type of expectations from the group that there is. In that area seems to be very interesting, though.
Understood.
Hey, Colin, also, if you want to have a conversation on abandon, I've been hosting the RCL study sessions. I don't know if you've seen them, but we've been doing discussions with this class, and I plan on sort of continuing stuff. We might take a little bit break after this, but plan on continuing my learning, at least there. So
okay, well, put a link in the chat there.
Yeah, I will.
Okay, well, I won't take any more of you guys' time, but I just wanted to really impress upon you that, you know, I find it fascinating, a lot of the stories that Lucas gives, especially the math behind it. And it's taken me through tons of Wikipedia pages. I'm sure everybody can relate to that. And it's, you know, if you like math at all, this is fascinating.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's attended the series. I think we've covered a lot of ground, and hopefully this is a good introduction for people who are, you know, want to find their way into the computational calculi or R-chain. So awesome. Thank you to everyone. I may do another series, but I have to think about it before launching into it. And looking forward to seeing most of you, I think, in Berlin at RCon 3.
Absolutely.
See you there.
Awesome. All right. It's time for